there's a sense, in my view, that Indonesia and Burma are strategically unimportant. They actually are very important. Indonesia really made a remarkable transition to multi-party democracy, and I would say that democracy is genuine. Burma is really one of the world's most serious but most forgotten tragedies in terms of death toll, atrocities, just horrific human rights violations. The international community needs to cut the lifelines to the military regime and provide a lifeline to the people. If Indonesia goes backwards, then we will have lost one of Asia and the world's most significant democratic success stories. In an era where democracy is increasingly under threat across the world, we can't afford to let that happen.
This is Dissidents and Dictators.
Hey there. I wanted to jump in with a quick update. Starting now, we'll be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks to bring you even better stories and guests. Be sure to follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Dissidents and Dictators to keep up to date on the latest episodes. We'd also love to hear your thoughts and questions, so reach out to us. Now, back to the show. Hi, Elisha. How you doing today?
I'm all right. How about you?
Well, I'm doing just fine. Now tell me, you're not back in New York yet. Where are you?
I'm not back. I'm still in beautiful England, my favorite place in the world. This morning I took a very, very cold, chilly English countryside walk to a farm, like a little farmhouse cafe, where I wrote and had a lot of coffee.
Well,
great.
That sounds absolutely romantic. I should say, and this is for further context for today's conversation. The last time I was out in the countryside was not the English countryside. I'd have to say it was the Indonesian countryside.
Oh,
out in the mangrove swamps of East Java, where me and my dear sweet wife were doing a little bit of bird watching on our honeymoon. Which is, again, why I'm so
did that
excited.
To your wife.
This is how I knew she was the right one for me. What was interesting about one of those mornings is that, again, we're staying in middle of nowhere hotel. And I remember her waking up around 4 o'clock in the morning in order for us to get out and get to the birds and opening the toilet. And there's a cockroach in there. And we said, oh boy, this is love.
Okay, just really quickly. Does your wife actually have any interest in birds, or she just yielded to a couple days out of love for you?
You know, the longer you're married to someone, the more you like the things that they like. And so she has, of course, grown to more like birdwatching.
Wow.
And I will say I have grown to like the Netflix TV show Bridgerton a lot more in those years since.
Oh, she's done some good work then.
I don't know if we're going to be talking about Bridgerton today, but
No,
certainly we'll be talking about Indonesia. So this is it's going to be a great conversation with Benedict.
Yeah, Benedict is a delight and very, very knowledgeable on Southeast Asia. He could probably talk, circles around us, but he's written a lot of books too. We'll include them. He mentions a couple of them at the end, and it's a really interesting conversation on a region that doesn't really necessarily get a lot of focus.
Well, especially in two countries like Indonesia and Burma, which, yes, have been in the headlines in the past, but certainly not recently. So I think it's going to be great to get folks up to speed with what has been taking place there and certainly what to expect moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be great.
All right.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us today, Ben.
No, thank you for having me. It's a privilege.
Now, I hear both you and Elisha are in London without me. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that's correct. Hopefully we'll see you in London soon.
That would be wonderful. Yes, I'll book my ticket now.
I'm a little outside of London at the moment, but close enough. An hour's train ride.
But Ben, you're from the UK originally, born and raised, correct?
That's correct. I was born in London. I grew up from the age of 7 out in the countryside in the southwest of England, a couple of hours from London. And then I came back to London for university and then lived overseas for a bit. And now I've been back in London for some years now.
Okay, so this has been home base for you for some time, even as you have been traveling the world, even as you've been working in country after country, and of course, on country after country. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood? Was there anything especially unique about it? Any core memories that are still with you, propelling you forward all these years later?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very happy childhood, a very happy family life. Both my parents, I would say, had a lot of international experience and interest. They traveled a lot. My mother had actually been a diplomat and had lived in Senegal in West Africa and then had lived in Japan before she met my father. My father was in business and he traveled a lot internationally for business. I was fortunate in that on family holidays, they took us to interesting places, not just to the beach in Cornwall, but to various interesting places around the world. So I think that's where I got my interest in the world at large. And after university, I decided to take what we call a gap year, a year between high school and university. But I decided not to go sort of backpacking or just traveling. I wanted to do something kind of meaningful. And I ended up teaching for 6 months, teaching English. I was 18 years old at the time, in the city of Qingdao in China, on the east coast of China, famous for the best beer in China, but that wasn't the reason I went there. It was a nice discovery once I was there. And it was really from my experience of living in Qingdao that I discovered a love of China and a lifelong interest in China. And then that led to a wider interest in the wider Asia region. I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years of my working life after graduating, which happened to be the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong. Oh, wow. And then from Hong Kong got involved in Burma, Indonesia, East Timor, other parts of the region.
So it was one step after another. This began when you were 18, and it's really been kind of off to the races for you ever since.
That's right, yeah.
I don't know if you were a smoker or not, but did you ever smoke lesser pandas when you were in China?
I'm not a smoker, and I've actually never been attracted to smoking, and certainly not to Chinese cigarettes, which I smelt around me, but I never tasted myself.
I regret to inform you that I've smoked a lot of Chinese cigarettes, and they are as harsh as you think that they are.
But Ben, you weren't working as a teacher at every one of these stops, whether it was in, I mean, in China, obviously you were, but in terms of in Burma, whether in East Timor and Maldives, this wasn't you just bouncing around from school to school. Obviously, eventually you helped co-found things like Hong Kong Watch and Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. What were the different positions that you actually had at each of these stopovers for you?
Yeah, so my time in Qingdao in China was my only teaching experience. When I graduated from university and moved to Hong Kong, it was as a journalist. Initially, my first sort of dream in life, entering my career, was a career in journalism. But the interest in human rights came about whilst I was at university. I heard a speaker who's a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Cox, a tireless champion of human rights in various parts of the world. I heard her speak on my university campus. Even as an undergraduate, that had a huge impact on me, and I got involved in human rights. I got involved with a human rights organization called CSW, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which particularly specializes in advocating for freedom of religion or belief for all people of all religions and people of no religion. While I was in Hong Kong, I developed my involvement in that further and then ended up working for CSW full-time after 5 years as a journalist in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We're going to hit a bunch of the region of Southeast Asia, which, is the specialty of yours. But I want to start off by talking about Indonesia, mostly because they have a new president that was just, sworn in last month in October. And he's kind of has a history in which HRF is uniquely focused on. We focus on authoritarian regimes, and he has a sort of authoritarian background. If we can talk about that a little bit, and maybe we can start talking about the country's history, and maybe talk about its democratic progress since 1998.
Well, Indonesia is a country that I love and greatly admire, and I think there's a lot of positive things we should acknowledge about it. It had many years of dictatorship, particularly under Suharto, who actually was the father-in-law of the newly elected president, Prabowo Subianto. But after the fall of Suharto, Indonesia really made a remarkable transition to multi-party democracy. And I would say that democracy is genuine. It's not perfect. No democracy is perfect, but it is genuine. And with that came an improvement in human rights in some areas. But I would say over the last 20, 25 years, one of the areas of human rights that has actually deteriorated, even as Indonesia has made a successful transition to democracy, is the whole area of freedom of religion or belief. Indonesia has this great tradition. It is, of course, the world's largest Muslim majority nation, but it's not an Islamic nation. Constitutionally, it safeguards the rights, at least of the 6 recognized religions. Followers of religions outside those 6 are less protected. But it is a secular state. It's a state that recognizes religious pluralism. But over the last 20 years or so, the rise of religious intolerance has been very concerning, and that's affected all minority religious groups, Christians, Ahmadiyas, Shias, and others.
Ben, has this taken place across Indonesia writ large? Are there specific islands or regions or provinces that has been especially concerning? Is it all in the federal government in Jakarta, or are there specific states that this is taking place more in? We can see more pronounced deterioration of things like freedom of religion in.
I would say initially, when it first started to happen, it was definitely happening in particular areas, more, small c religiously conservative areas, particularly West Java, Aceh, which of course is the one part of Indonesia that has full Sharia law, and certain other areas. I think I would say in the last 10 years, it has become a much more nationwide issue. And I wrote a report with CSW about 8 or 9 years ago called Indonesia Pluralism in Peril, which charted this nationwide phenomenon. It does vary to degree. There are certain areas that are more severe than other areas, but I would say it is, and it does depend to some extent on the local authorities rather than the national government, but it is a nationwide problem now.
Well, we can link to the Pluralism in Peril report in the show notes for this, Ben. Did this play much of a role in the recent elections, in the recent rise of Prabowo himself, or was this something that hasn't necessarily had that much electoral impact at the federal, at the national level yet?
Yeah, it definitely does play in elections, and particularly with Prabowo, who, although he himself is definitely not an extremist, he's a pluralistic-minded person in religious terms, but he, for political reasons, has over the years aligned himself to the more Islamist groups and used religion and religious intolerance as a political tool. So we saw that particularly in the previous election in 2019 when he lost, and he really tried to weaponize religion in that election. I think we saw it a little bit this year, but perhaps not quite as much, but it does feature.
If I could just, before, I keep dominating the conversation, I'm
No,
sorry,
you're
Elisha.
good. No,
I
you're
did
good.
want to ask, though, is it fair or would it be accurate to describe Prabowo as a populist? I mean, some of the behavior that you're describing there, Ben, of him not being necessarily an extremist unto himself, but using that for electoral purposes, strikes me as populist in nature. But is that a fair description for him as a political force unto himself?
Definitely. I think that's a very fair description. And it's very interesting, his image in the past was of sort of strong man, former army general, aligned to religious groups. In this election, he tried to play a somewhat more, I would never call him cuddly, but he tried to play a more cuddly, grandfatherly role. You saw him at his rallies sort of dancing, and I mean, there were sort of parallels with the newly elected President of the United States in that sense. So yeah, definitely a populist.
Do you think that he's actually capable of leading Indonesia as a democracy, especially with his reputation for human rights abuses, abducting of, folks in 1998 in Jakarta? With this reputation, is he actually capable of leading a democratic country?
I think I would say time will tell, but the international community should keep a very close eye on his presidency and what he does. I haven't yet seen evidence that he's going to dismantle democracy, but certainly his history is a history of authoritarian tendencies. And I would also say that the outgoing president, Joko Widodo, or known as Jokowi, has actually been quite a disappointment on this front as well, because Jokowi was seen as very much a Democrat and the people's choice when he was elected some years ago. Under his presidency, he's also undermined human rights in certain ways. So it's possible Prabowo may build on that, but we'll have to wait and see. But definitely we should keep a close eye on him.
I was going to say, Ben, to that point in terms of the international community's concern, it doesn't seem like there has been any kind of outspoken focus or even calls for focus on, or let alone pressure on, the new president in Indonesia. It seems like certainly there's plenty of room to grow. Are there any, actually, I'll give you the opportunity, are there any specific organizations that are keeping the pressure on, or that are keeping an outsized focus on Indonesian domestic politics that folks can follow for more?
There definitely are, although not that many, interestingly. And I think Indonesia has definitely fallen off both the media and the human rights spotlight, partly, in large part, because of all the other crises we have in the world that are much more serious. But Human Rights Watch, for example, has an excellent researcher on Indonesia, and they publish reports periodically. CSW, my former organization, continues to follow in Indonesia, and there are a few others. But I would say definitely it's not a human rights situation that should be at the top of the list, given all the other problems in the world, but it definitely should be on the list and should be something people follow.
Just going back to his, this election really quickly, what is the winning, he's had 2 failed attempts in the past. What made this one successful? Is it because he tried to reposition his image and people bought it, or?
Yeah, it's a combination of factors. I mean, I was there in 2019 in Indonesia during the elections and sort of monitored the elections for a few days, and was extremely relieved when he lost that election. And I thought that was the end of him. I thought, having tried twice and given his age, he wouldn't come back. But as we see throughout the world, people do come back, even at quite an advanced age.
He's in his 70s too, right? 70?
He is. Yes, that's right. I think there were 2 main factors that led to his success this time. The first was that after Jokowi's election in 2019, Jokowi brought Prabowo, his rival, into his cabinet as defense minister, so he had a position in government. And the second is that Jokowi himself then backed Prabowo, who'd been his arch rival in this year's election, and Jokowi's family were closely associated with Prabowo. So with Jokowi's support, that made all the difference.
Because you've been there and traveled and get to know the people, as you say, it's one of those countries that's sort of fallen off the map in a way, and that I don't think most people think of it unless they're thinking of, going to a resort. Can you kind of paint a picture of what the people are like, and what is it that they're actually looking for? Is it religious freedom mostly, or is it out of all of the things that you could tick off, in the States, it's inflation and economy, right? What are those voting factors for them, and then of course leading to a success?
Yeah, well, I think I'm right in saying Indonesia it's not the world's largest, but it's certainly one of the world's largest democracies, and it is most extraordinary.
3rd largest.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it is the most extraordinary landmass in terms of size of the country, the thousands and thousands of islands. So an extraordinary success in many ways, the fact that democracy has been established across such a diverse and large landmass. It's both religiously and ethnically diverse across all the different islands. And I would say, by and large, the diverse peoples of Indonesia have embraced democracy. In terms of religious freedom, I think most ordinary Indonesians still have a mindset that is tolerant, that they want religious freedom. But there has been this growth over the last 10 or 20 years of more extremist, intolerant Islamist groups. There's been influence of Wahhabi literature and teachings. There have been sporadic terrorist attacks on bombs and other attacks on churches and on the Ahmadiyya community, who I got to know quite well, who consider themselves a strand of Islam but are regarded by many other Muslims as being heretics and hence face severe persecution. So it has these problems, but I would say overall the majority of the country does want freedom and tolerance.
And how long are the term limits? I presume 4-year term limit?
5 years,
5
because
years.
The previous elections were 2019 and then
Right,
the elections this year. And one thing I should say just in terms of elections that is a real indicator of how religion and religious intolerance can really be weaponized politically is the key case a few years ago of the then governor of Jakarta, who was known as Ahok, who was a hugely successful governor. He was very popular because he was tackling corruption, he was improving public services, he seemed to be delivering for people, and he happened to be a Christian. And he had been Jokowi's deputy when Jokowi was governor of Jakarta, and then he took over as governor when Jokowi became president. When Ahok came up for re-election and was running his own race to have a second term as governor, his political opponents had no political card to play against him because he was very popular for all the reasons I've described. And so they played the religion card and went round from mosque to mosque saying, Indonesian Muslims shouldn't elect a non-Muslim as governor. And then they pinned totally fabricated charges under the blasphemy law, which is the main legal weapon that's used against people. And
Right.
Ahok ended up in prison for a period of time and, of course, lost his re-election bid. And I remember being in Indonesia at that time and people of all religions saying to me, if they can do this to the governor of Jakarta, that's an indicator of how serious the weaponization of religion is in the country.
We'll be back with more from Benedict Rogers.
There's still time this Giving Tuesday season to support HRF's mission to advance freedom and democracy worldwide. And don't forget, every gift you make by the end of November enters you into a special raffle to win 2 patron passes to the 2025 Oslo Freedom Forum in Norway, taking place May 26 to 28. Join us in celebrating the power of generosity and stand with us in the global movement against tyranny.
Now, back to the show. I was going to say, this is a sort of depressing note, but keeping in the theme of religious as well as ethnic persecution, I wanted to do something of a hard pivot, Ben, to discuss Burma, which I know you do a lot of work on as well. Can you give us some of the top line news developments on the political side of things from Burma from maybe the past few months, even past year or two, that folks may have not have had the chance to follow as closely as perhaps they should have?
Absolutely. Well, Burma is really one of the world's most serious but most forgotten tragedies in terms of death toll, atrocities, just horrific human rights violations. And I've been involved with Burma for more than 20 years. I have the dubious distinction of having been deported from Burma not once but twice.
Congratulations.
Well done you.
And I've probably visited the country 50 or 60 times, both inside and to the border areas. And of course, there was this decade or so of apparent opening where some level of democracy was introduced. Aung San Suu Kyi was in government rather than being under house arrest. Everything changed when the coup happened on the 1st of February 2021. And since then, the current military regime is definitely the most brutal dictatorship the country has endured, and they've endured several incarnations of military dictatorships. What we've seen since the coup is hundreds of places of worship being deliberately targeted by the military. So churches, and of course, going back some years, the persecution of Muslims, both the Rohingya Muslims, which has resulted in a genocide, and other Muslims. It does seem that the military is turning its sights now much more onto Christians, particularly because several of the ethnic groups are majority Christian. Yeah. And so hundreds of churches destroyed. On a political level, something like over 27,000 activists arrested, and at least more than 20,000 remain in jail today, including, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi. A litany of war crimes and atrocities. I mean, torture on a widespread, horrific level, rape as a weapon of war, forced labor, and so on. I think it was earlier this year, the regime introduced, because they are facing an armed resistance, a very well-organized and strong armed resistance throughout the country, and the military have lost quite a lot of ground. So they've introduced a policy of forced conscription. And they're rounding up young men and women to join their ranks to strengthen their offensive against the pro-democracy opposition.
Yeah. I mean, journalistically, what do you I mean, I know that because you've written a lot on this, great writer, by the way, but what do you think it is about regions like Indonesia and Burma that get attention just for a little bit? And I would even wager, when I was at the New York Post, I was writing about, the genocide, the Rohingya quite a bit, but it felt like I felt alone in doing it. And maybe you'd get a news coverage of, oh, here's a death toll, but no one really covered it. No one seemed to really care, maybe more so in the West. What do you think it is? What do you think it is about these regions in the West that doesn't seem to get a lot of coverage or focus?
Good question. I think it's partly, of course, the other crises that are much more dominant in the media. I mean, obviously, currently the Middle East and Ukraine. Right. And I suppose they have more strategic interest, the Ukraine obviously, but particularly to Europe, and because of Russia's war. So that's probably one reason. There's a sense, in my view, a wrong perception that Indonesia and Burma are strategically unimportant. They actually are very important, both in terms of China's role in the region and in terms of the natural resources in both countries, and both countries actually matter economically, but there is a perception that they perhaps are less important strategically. In the case of Burma, there's probably also a sense, particularly since Aung San Suu Kyi's period in government, that she was quite a disappointment to many people. Everyone had huge hopes for her. She didn't do the kind of things we thought she would do, and actually on the Rohingya issue took a very profoundly troubling stand. And she sort of fell from grace. And in my view, that's not a reason to ignore her plight or her country's plight, because whatever mistakes she made in office, she was democratically elected. She should be in government, not in prison. And we shouldn't ignore that. But sadly, I think because of her fate, a lot of people have sort of moved on and ignore Burma.
Well, she won the Nobel Peace Prize some time ago.
That's correct.
I mean, she was certainly the most high-profile Burmese politician, at least outside of the country itself. Now, she is currently in prison.
She is.
Right.
Has she received any sentencing, or is she still awaiting trial? What is her What is her status?
She's received multiple sentences, and it's been a while since I checked this, so I may have this slightly wrong, but I think the accumulation of sentences that she received amounts to something like, well, several decades in prison. I mean, basically, if she serves all the sentences she's been given at the age that she is, in her late 70s, she will die in prison.
Ben, for someone who's been following Burmese politics as long as you have, and again, coming in and out of the country as long as you have, and of course being kicked out of the country as many times as you have, as well, are you surprised? Well, let me ask you this. Are you surprised by either the level of brutality exhibited by the current regime, by the current military dictatorship, or the fact that they are now targeting further religious minorities? Again, you just listed some of the churches that they have been targeting as well. Are these elements that are surprising to you, or is this simply an extension of what you expected from this regime as soon as we saw this coup succeed 3 years ago?
Yeah, they're not surprising to me at all in terms of, the military has a long, long history of extreme brutality. However, they are, as you've just put it, they are definitely an extension. They've gone even further than they had in the past. But it's in their nature, sadly, to be treating their people in this way.
Yeah. Well, I guess, can you give us some forecast for the future for these? For Indonesia, I think we just have to keep watching. 5-year presidency, is that going to slip back into, authoritarianism, and try to keep that checks in place? But can you kind of give us a forecast for Burma and for Indonesia as we look to the future?
Yes, I mean, I think Burma has the potential to go one way or the other. I mean, it's a desperate human rights and humanitarian tragedy at the moment. There is the fact that the military regime does appear to be on the back foot now. The pro-democracy alliance of armed groups have taken a lot of ground in the country. It's said that the military is only in control of perhaps as little as a third of the country in terms of total control. So there is the possibility that there could be a breakthrough in Burma, but if it comes, it will come at an extremely high price for the people of Burma. And I think what is really needed is for the international community to do much more. Countries have done some things. There are some sanctions in place, but the international community needs to, as I often say, cut the lifelines to the military regime and provide a lifeline to the people. So that means increased sanctions, trying to enforce an arms embargo to stop the military getting access to arms, particularly an aviation fuel embargo to stop their ability to carry out aerial bombardments of civilians, which is a new tactic they've been using since the coup, and providing humanitarian aid, particularly cross-border, so that it doesn't fall into the hands of the military, to those who need it, and empowering voices of human rights defenders from the country. Those are all things we need to be doing, and looking at the question of accountability and ending impunity and how we hold the generals to account for the atrocity crimes they've committed.
Yeah.
In the case of Indonesia, I think Indonesia's great success as having transitioned to democracy is increasingly under threat. We saw that in some ways under Jokowi, and I think there are reasons to be concerned about Prabowo, and definitely we should keep a watching brief on it, because if Indonesia goes backwards, then we will have lost one of Asia and the world's most significant democratic success stories. In an era where democracy is increasingly under threat across the world, we can't afford to let that happen.
Well, Ben, maybe as a final question, speaking of things that folks can follow moving forward, how can they follow more of your work, your research, and your commentary on not only Burma and Indonesia, but the region writ large?
Well, thank you. So I write very widely. People can follow me on Twitter, and I share all my articles on Twitter. I've written a number of books. My latest book is a book primarily on China called The China Nexus, but it has a chapter on Burma and the Chinese regime's relationship with the Burmese regime. It also has a chapter on North Korea as well, which is another area I've been involved with. Then there are various organizations that I'm associated with. The most obvious ones are Hong Kong Watch, which focuses on Hong Kong and China. And as I've mentioned earlier, the work of CSW. I've given you a lot of options. Probably the best one is my Twitter account, and we can go from there.
Wonderful.
I do love reading your Twitter account, and I always look for your work, which I very much enjoy reading. And I mean that truthfully. It's a great writer.
Oh, Thank you very much.
Benedict Rogers, thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to speak with you again very soon.
Thank you
Hopefully
so
we'll
much.
have you
for
back
having me.
on.
I'd love to. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for today's conversation with Benedict Rogers.
This episode is produced and engineered by Omar Al-Fotihi and edited by Talia Edgar-Chalker. Our intern is Sage Gibson.
Dissidents and Dictators is a production of the Human Rights Foundation, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.